All right, AKA Padders. Hey, it's a new angle. How many times have you guys seen me from my actual workstation? You guys, I know you guys haven't seen these shelves before, but guys, what are we doing today? It's Sunday presentation. Every single Sunday, I'd like to bring you guys something that's just been on the tip of my brain, the tip of Peter's brain, as we say around here. And what is it? Well, we have Fantastic Four 2025. It's another blockbuster. I mean, guys, the fourth Fantastic Four movie is opening this weekend, and we have a Silver Surfer. Here we go. AK Packers. My passion for storytelling runs throughout my entire work. I'm the guy in meetings I'll give a speech about the significance of our business cards and how they have to tell a story. Every piece tells a story. And through the creation and the rise of the Silver Surfer, that's what we're talking about today. A DVD supplemental feature from the rise of the Silver Surfer. I clipped out the portion of this special feature when they talk about Silver Surfer. It's almost like a segment within a segment. Here we have Illuminaries discussing the Silver Surfer. Why is this important? Because we have a different Silver Surfer now on the big screen. It's not Norrin Red. It's someone else. Who the hell is it? It's a chick. I don't know, but she's naked, so I'm in. I'm just confused. And I just want to show you guys something. And this is a point now that's completely lost. And like I said, it has been on the tip of my brain. Here's the point. DC always had the Sandman, Watchmen, DKR. These were the intellectual comics. And Marvel, for a very long time, you might want to say until the 2000s. Rise of the Silver Surfer, 2007. It took Marvel a long time to build like deep, meaningful, philosophical, like big brainy books. It took them a long time, but they always had good reads. It was just they never had top shelf books until the modern day. Now, everything before that, here's the wild thing. It was the Silver Surfer. The Silver Surfer was Marvel's big brain characters. He was for the college crowd. He was for intellectuals. He was for people who were of the mind and of thought. People that wished and hoped for the comic book format to transform and transcend and become something beyond the matter. That's what Silver Surfer was. That's why it was significant and groundbreaking and even shocking that he was going to be in the live action feature. And ever since this movie came out, people have wanted a solo Silver Surfer movie. As soon as this movie was announced, they were like, we're talking about a Surfer solo movie, which is now a marketing method. As soon as, Superman comes out, and it's like, James Gunn's like, oh, well, we're talking about a Guy Gardner solo movie. Not exactly on the nose, but you got, I'm just using that to illustrate my point. But guys, here it is. Back when the most intellectual read that Marvel had was Silver Surfer, and now we have a bunch of luminaries celebrating it. Thank you for hanging out. Hope you enjoy this. I'll catch you right there. I'll catch you in the comments. Flex all day.
I used to love to lecture at colleges. I've probably done more of that than any man alive. I've been to every school in America, probably twice at least. Anyhow, I would talk to the guys, and I would speak for a few minutes, then I'd open it up to questions and answers. That's what I love, because then you're really talking to people. I would get more questions about the Silver Surfer, especially from the brightest people in the audience. Somehow they'd be interested in the philosophy and the message and why he spoke that way and how I felt about him and blah, blah, blah. Wherever I went, and man, I got a kick out of that.
The Surfer's popularity really came from the fact that he was the outsider, trapped on Earth, and he allowed us to hold up a mirror to a lot of what was going on at the time, to take a look at the things that were wrong with society, that were wrong in the world. And I think that's a classic science fiction trope. You can always address what's going on outside your window a lot more easily with, you know, a guy who rides a silver surfboard than you can with flesh and blood people.
The Surfer has never been Suzi, he's been more of a cult character. You know, within that universe, certain people respond. And so he was a fascinating character to begin with, because in the beginning he was he was completely cold and learning about humanity, and then he makes this phenomenal sacrifice. He sacrifices everything, all this power, the entire universe, to help these people. You know, so he becomes a fallen angel, he becomes Jesus. Any metaphor you want to throw toward it, it'll work, you know?
The great thing that Marvel did was find a way to talk to people who were older about comics, to give them more adult relationships and so on and so forth. They really caught the college audience. That was their first thing. They were able to do stuff that the Superman and Batman and the more traditional heroes had not done. They had really never grown out of this ghetto of childhood that they were stuck in. And Marvel opened up a whole new universe.
The Surfer was an interesting character in the fact that he had have almost limitless potential, but the character is only as good as what is being done with it by the writer and the artist team that has it. I was a kid when the Silver Surfer first appeared. He was an incredible character, a noble creature himself. He was working for, you know, a very hungry giant who was going to do in Earth. It was an incredible story.
We were doing a Fantastic Four story, and I wanted Galactus to be the villain. I was very proud of the Galactus that I had dreamed up, you know. I said to Jack, make him the biggest guy you can draw. He's a demigod. Make him look like a demigod. He's a guy who destroys planets. And he doesn't do it because he's cruel, it's because he's hungry. He eats their energy. So he goes through the galaxy, or maybe through the universe, finding planets that have enough energy to sustain him. I thought I was a genius with this idea. So I got the artwork, and there was some nut on a flying surfboard running around. I hadn't told Jack anything about that. I said, who's that? He said, well, I figure anybody who's as big and powerful as you say Galactus should be, he shouldn't have to go and search for planets to eat by himself. He ought to have somebody, a herald, who goes ahead and does it. And that was all. I mean, to Jack, he was a herald. He was going to find planets, and he only had them in a few panels.
The first time I can remember seeing the original Surfer material, the stuff that Jack and Stan did in FF 48 through 50, and they were all my brother's comics. And you know, I was 4 or 5 maybe, and we sort of would paw through that box every once in a while when my brother wasn't looking. And I can remember those issues in particular always kind of weirded me out, because the Kirby artwork was always, you know, kind of grotesque to my 5-year-old eyes. But it was a grotesque that you couldn't look away from. So I kept going back to those issues, even though, you know, they probably gave me nightmares the night thereafter.
I always found Galactus's and the Silver Surfer's relationship really kind of strange. Here was this rather honorable and downright noble creature floating around in space on this surfboard and looking terrific, but what he was basically doing was bringing the devil and destruction to wherever he went. He was an immediate hit. Everybody just loved his character.
I said, this is so unique and so original, and I liked the way Jack drew him because he looked so heroic and so noble, more than heroic. There was a nobility to him. And then I decided I want to use him in a lot of stories. And what I want to do is have him really be my voice. I want him to say all the things that maybe I've been thinking of for years, like, we live in the greatest planet in the world. There's enough food for everybody. We have sunshine. We have enough water, beautiful fields. Everybody should be happy living on Earth. It's paradise. And yet, are we crazy? We fight each other. We hate each other. We tear the place up. But what is the matter with us? Are we an insane race? So I wanted the Silver Surfer to mouth all those kind of thoughts, as if somebody coming from a rational world were to see all the nutty, irrational things that human beings do.
Well, at the time that the Surfer was created, things like Gilgamesh were very popular, the epic poem. People were setting off into countercultural tracks. The Surfer fit right into that. The Surfer was a saint who could come in and do commentary on the insanity of our own society. And Stan was pretty good at doing some, very basic level philosophical storylines along those ways.
I think the 60s was obviously a time of great upheaval culturally and in the society. And because the Surfer was an outsider, because he hadn't, bought into the system to some extent, he could see the inequities of racism, of class wars. And I think Stan really held him up as an example of what we could be without all of the baggage that we had at the time. I think he was embraced by the counterculture to a certain extent because he didn't have any of the baggage. He wasn't he wasn't a tool of the man.
This was 1965 when he first appeared, and so we were just going into the whole Beatles, Vietnam thing, and a sort of alien being who didn't belong on this planet was a popular concept, caught a lot of people's attention. There were a number of blacklight posters that were produced at that time featuring the Marvel characters, but the Surfer is probably the most iconic. And again, because he was a silver guy in the blackness of space, he looked great under blacklight, And I would venture to say there wasn't a college dorm in the country that didn't have a Silver Surfer poster in there somewhere. He was an icon. As I say, the comic itself never really kind of sustained that at the time. But he was there. Joe Satriani, who was a Bay Area guitar rock and roll guy, one of the covers of his albums had a Silver Surfer piece of art on it. I mean, it was a pop culture phenomenon.
This is the guy who had Stan's soapbox on the bullpen page. So here it was, and the first issues were double-sized 44-page stories. So it was a 44-page Stan soapbox, essentially. He got to talk about whatever was on his mind and do it in this wonderfully melodramatic but truly heartfelt. Stan at his best was always so from the heart. And that's why I love that character and why I love those books so much.
I really thought of him as a little bit Christ-like, with what we know about Christ. And he really cared about things and about mankind and about everything. I tried to make him the goodest character I could, and also the most misunderstood.
Initially, the surfer went about his business dispassionately, as he had done everywhere else. But he comes into contact with the Fantastic Four, and he comes into contact with Alicia Masters and is exposed to their humanity. And that exposure changes him somewhat. That exposure makes him see the worth of humanity, and eventually leads to him rebelling against his master, Galactus.
Basically, they were his bridge to people of Earth. They were the first folks that he was actually in contact with, and sort of set his tone of how he was going to deal with Earth people after that. He met the best and then started working his way down the ladder from there. As I recall, they did a little story bit with the Thing and the Silver Surfer having a squabble over Alice Master, this blind sculptor that the Thing had a thing for. I think that was really kind of minor in the book, and then they went on from there. But it was nice, fun 1960s comics. But they didn't know quite what to do with him afterwards, because he was this cosmic character that they sort of had set down on Earth and wouldn't let him do anything. And he was like that for close to a decade afterwards.
I think when the Surfer came back into FF, really less than a year later from his initial appearance, and they got involved with Doom trying to steal his powers, you know, that really brought into focus what the Surfer could be, and played him against the classic FF villain in Dr. Doom.
This was one of the high points of Jack and Stan's career on the Fantastic Four. They did over 100 issues of this book, so it's hard to pick any one that was the best, but this was one of the best, this particular story arc.
At some point, I liked the Silver Surfer so much I wanted to give him his own series. Well, Jack was too busy. Jack would have been the ideal guy. But luckily, John Buscema was available. John Buscema, to me, is the closest thing the comic field ever had to Michelangelo.
His layouts were very, very simple, almost sketchy, and yet every single line, you didn't need to see the rest of it because you looked at the line and you could see the rest of the drawing. I mean, he was a brilliant draftsman.
He said sure, he'd love to do the Silver Surfer. The series had a nice consistency as far as the artwork went, and I wrote them all. They were the best I could do, and I loved that series.
Jack's was blocky. He was a very cubistic artist. They say Jack never erased anything. The first time he went down, that was it. John Buscema, on the other hand, created this very graceful and regal, noble-looking creature that was floating around on a surfboard in space or in the sky, and you just were incredibly impressed by the visual of it alone.
With John Buscema, he played with the origin, and he really took what he loves to call the Christ on a surfboard aspect of it and brought it to the forefront. Well, a lot of people out there are going to get the Christ on the surfboard thing and roll their eyes and want to walk away. But me, I'm like, yeah, Christ on a surfboard. You know, I loved the philosophical aspects of the character. I love the sort of Lord Byron poses and the long speeches. You know, reminds me of Rod Serling. He'd always have these characters giving these wonderful, long, outraged speeches about humanity. You know, no one had done anything quite like what Stan did with the Surfer then.
Up until that point, John Buscema had been doing little jobs here and there at Marvel and really hadn't gotten something he could sink his teeth into, and they gave him the Silver Surfer. It was just incredible. He was able to do all the things that he was like hinting at in these other books, like he'd been doing some Avengers or something like that. But then he did this Silver Surfer book. It was just this incredibly beautiful book. It was the best looking book Marvel was putting out at that time. You know, Stan ran off on his little stories, but it was basically John who just showed everybody how you should draw the Silver Surfer.
The Surfer that Stan and John Buscema did, I think, to me anyway, had a real different tone and texture to what Stan and Jack did in FF. And I think one of the reasons is because the Surfer was suddenly, you know, he was a main character. He was the star of the show, not just a supporting player. And I think that really allowed Stan in particular to get into him as a character and really dig into his head. He was a mirror for us, and especially for the time. You know, you're talking about the late 60s and early 70s, obviously a great deal of upheaval in the culture. And John Buscema brought a real grace and fluidity to the Surfer that I don't think Jack Kirby captured as well, because Jack's stuff was really about power, you know, superheroes that really jumped off the page at you, whereas John's stuff was maybe finer in some ways and really fit the tone of the stories that Stan was doing at the time.
They're not the same character. One was a cold alien learning about humanity, and the other was a human, essentially. He was from the planet Zen-La, but he was a passionate human. So it really was different.
John Buscema's Surfer was a lot more fluid and a lot more graceful than Jack's Surfer. I love both of them, and I think they're both appropriate depictions of the Surfer, but I think because of the lengthy run that John had on the book when it was a solo title, I think that's the Surfer that a lot of people really see in their minds. Jack did the Surfer as a guest star in FF more often than not, and he really looked a lot more alien when Jack drew him. I think when John got a hold of him, he made him a little bit more like us.
Stan did have a nice one last run on it with an artist, a French artist named Mobius, which is also, you know, one of the high points of the visual history of this character.
Oh, Mobius! Somehow at the meeting I said to him, how would you like to do the Silver Surfer? And he amazed me, he surprised me. He said, yeah, I'd love to. Well, he doesn't get that emotional. He probably said, yes, I would like to. But that was good enough for me. I really think, much as I love the Surfer, I think the story that I did with Mobius was my favorite Surfer story, because that one, to me, really had a message. I was amazed. I loved that story, and the way Mobius drew it, of course, was different than any Marvel artist could have done it. He had his own style, a magnificent style, and oh yeah, that, of all the stories I've written, that's got to go right up at the top of my all-time favorites.
Later on, they put him in a book called The Defenders, which didn't sell all that well, even though it had the Hulk and Submariner and other characters in it. It wasn't until, like I said, about a decade later, when they decided they were going to let him off the earth and let different people other than Stan write it, that it actually started selling very well.
I didn't want anybody to write the Surfer but me. And for a long time, I was the only guy who put the words in Norrin Radd's mouth. But I couldn't hold on to them forever and, you know, had to let other people write them. I'm sure they did a wonderful job. I couldn't get myself to read the stories. I could not get myself to read Silver Surfer stories that other people wrote, because I wouldn't care if Shakespeare had written them. I'd have been disappointed.
Well, the Silver Surfer had been around for about 20 years by this point. He had been created in 1965, and this was about 1985. I'm not sure of the exact date, but it was about 20 years before we got to this point. And in that 20 years, there had been the Stan Lee, John Buscema series, There had been a couple of other one-shots. There'd been guest star appearances, but he had never really been able to sell comics. People loved him, but he didn't sell until this series came along. When I started writing and I started reading up on space for the first time, I mean really, and grokking the concept of just how far it is between things, and how what's in between them is basically emptiness and darkness, and you know, there's light from some sources and so forth, but basically you're on the largest black stage ever. And that was a consciousness that nobody else had, and really appealed to me for that, you know, for that purpose. I mean, not only was it getting old, not only was it really old that he was stuck on Earth, but also there was so much he could do once he got off Earth. I mean, he's a space guy, and all the stuff about meeting the various entities of space that Marvel had created, it was all right there once you could actually get at it. To my mind, he was sort of an average guy. I mean, possibly with more heroic grandeur somewhere in there, but he wasn't some special person necessarily. He was just somebody who stood up to Galactus and said, if you don't eat everybody on my planet, I will do whatever you want. Then he was sent out into space to travel alone and stop dealing with people. I wanted to explore him. I mean, again, Silver Surfer is limited by nature, and exploring that limitation was interesting to me, but again, because he's limited, there's only so much exploration you can do on that regard. So I was much more interested over time in space, in where he could go, in what it would be like to live in space, and what he could find in the Marvel space when he could go out there. And I was able to connect all these different entities into one coherent universe. And that was the fun part for me, I think. So that book sold. I mean, I think that was the key, that we all liked him. We all thought he was a great guy, but until he could really do everything that he could do, you couldn't really get everything out of him that you could. And people really responded to that Silver Surfer run.
When I started off was just to bring back Thanos, believe it or not, and which I did, which led into the Infinity Gauntlet. So the Silver Surfer and Infinity Gauntlet were basically almost the same book for the most part. In fact, for the most time, they had the same artist, a guy named Ron Lim.
Ron Lim his stuff is more cartoony in a sense, but that's not a pejorative in comic book terms. It just means that he's having a little more fun with the, playing with the art. Ron was able to really make it sort of more fun, I think. Really give it more pizzazz.
Ron always gave me pretty much what I envisioned. He and I were very much on the same wavelength. I mean, there would have been some things I would have changed in positioning the characters, but Ron wanted to tell the story that I wanted to tell, and he was always right on the money with what he was doing with it. A very underrated artist. After we had moved on from that storyline, I started thinking that the soul of the Silver Surfer had to be very convoluted and confused, because he was the epitome of good, but he had done such dreadful evil. But it had no effect on him. And so I did a storyline where it was revealed that Galactus had manipulated his very soul. Well, everyone asks me about why I do cosmic stories, and my pat answer is I don't like drawing horses or cars. But the truth of it is that if you get out of Earth and you create your own cosmic venue for these characters to go into, it gives you a lot more possibilities of what you can explore. You can do a physical manifestation of an abstract idea, such as greed, or in the case of the Surfer, guilt. I was actually able to manifest his guilt in a physical way by taking him into this more cosmic environment. This was a point where I wanted to more humanize the character. I wanted to examine the contradictions of the fact that he was so noble that he had been involved in all these heinous crimes in the past. Basically, I wanted to sort of visualize what his guilt would look like. So when he confronts Galactus, he begins to hallucinate once the manipulations of his soul have been removed, and he is his normal self, so to speak. And then these hallucinations included him falling into an ocean of blood that he had helped Galactus spill. It was basically trying to illustrate the darkness that he would have found in his soul once the blinders were taken off. I wanted to humanize him. He was this saint up until that point in many ways. Saints can get boring. He was a tragic figure. I wanted to make him even more tragic, but with a few more facets than he had at that point. And I thought bringing in his actual conscience would have been the way of doing it. My favorite issue of the Silver Surfer run was the issue where we first bring back Drax, and they don't know what to do with him because he's this huge powerhouse who, in this particular incarnation, comes back sort of brain dead, and all he wants to do is watch cartoons on TV, specifically the elf cartoons. I had a tremendous amount of fun doing this character, this very serious character in the past, and putting on this little comic edge. And he was something that the Silver Surfer very much needed because it was a very dour story arc I was working on, and we needed Drax in there just to sort of lighten things up.
I think my chief goal with the Surfer was to not screw it up. Jim had had a fairly titanic run on it in terms of what he did and the kind of stories that he told. So I was taking over from Jim Starlin. You know, he's the cosmic guy in comics. You don't get any better than Jim Starlin for telling these kinds of stories. You know, it was good for me to have that kind of safety net initially, and then be able to start telling my own stories after that. I think that one of the best compliments I ever got on the Surfer stuff was that somebody came up to me and said, "Oh, I didn't even know Starlin had stopped writing the story. I just thought he was still around." And I thought, well, I'm probably doing something right then, because Jim's run was fantastic and really kind of redefined the character. I thought if I was following in those footsteps, I was probably doing okay. When I did the Surfer, the stories we told a lot of times ended up in, you know, two guys punching each other. So that was very much, you know, a learned writing style, was that, you know, you had to have some over-the-top action in virtually every issue. The kind of stuff that you couldn't show in a movie at the time. You know, my chief goal was to give the reader something every issue that they hadn't seen before, something that was really visually exciting that they couldn't get anywhere else. But I remember one of the things that my editor told me at the time, this was Craig Anderson, was the first editor that I ever worked for. You know, he said, "You're writing the Surfer, this is like Shakespeare in space. These people love harder, fight harder. They do everything on an operatic scale. So make sure that when you write the book, that everything is on an operatic scale." And I think thankfully we had a lot of crossover material, and we had a lot of stories that tied into the Infinity Gauntlet at the time. So to some extent that sort of was like holding my hand as I got used to this. This was really on-the-job training for me. And since we had these other stories that we had to tie into, I wasn't out on an island. We were all sort of working towards the same goal. The character that I enjoyed the most was Thanos, because he was, he was, to me, one of the best Marvel villains ever, because he wasn't a guy that wanted to rob a bank. He wasn't a guy that wanted to take over the country. He wanted to please death with a capital D. That's a motivation way beyond anybody else. And he was a multifaceted character. Obviously, he's a Starlin creation, and if there was anybody I enjoyed writing as much as the Surfer, it was definitely Thanos. One of the things that I found really interesting when I came on the book was that the Surfer is no longer the Herald of Galactus. He's out on his own. He broke away from Galactus because he didn't want to be a party to Galactus eating worlds. He didn't want to be the guy laying out the buffet. The current Herald was Frankie Ray. Nova was given that title in the FF stories at the time. And I found it really intriguing that somebody from Earth could be involved in, basically setting the buffet table for this world eater. And I guess I was really intrigued by the fact that here was an alien who had rebelled against his master and didn't want to do that anymore. But yet somebody from Earth, basically a typical Earth woman, said, "Oh, I'll do that. Lead him to the world so we can devour him? Yeah, sign me up for that." So I wanted to deal with that. I wanted to deal with how she was okay with that, how the fact that she was kind of a party to mass murder. I like the dynamic between the Surfer and Frankie, because in some ways he had more humanity than she did.
One of my frustrations about my run on the book was that I had lots of things that I wanted to do that never quite happened. The big thing I wanted to do was actually do the death of Galactus and play with that. I want to do a cosmic dead man walking, with Galactus having to face what he's done. And all he really wants before he dies, while I'm building up this whole big cosmic epic, it wasn't just Galactus and Silver Surfer talking to each other, but what he really wants is the Silver Surfer's forgiveness. You know what I mean? That's the only soul in the universe that he cares about. Because one thing that was always unstated there was that Galactus on some level cared about the Surfer and respected the Surfer. So the idea that Galactus is going to die and all he wants is the forgiveness of the Silver Surfer before he goes for his sins, I thought it was a great story. But every few months something would happen. It was like all this stuff was going on, so I kept having to adjust my storylines. But what am I gonna, So that's kind of how I felt working on the Silver Surfer. The biggest problem with the Surfer was it was still a superhero comic book. So while he was giving, 30-panel speeches about the futility of violence, he always ended up having to fight somebody and drop a building on their heads. But that's what I respond to in that character. I wrote the book for a short period in the 90s, and George Perez, I think, had wisely brought him back to Earth and established a relationship with Alicia Masters and brought back that Surfer and humanity element to it that I think is what really makes the character unique. The cosmic being who comes down to Earth, sees us with different eyes, and yet responds to the inherent decency and humanity despite all the horrible things we do. And that's the tension, I think, that makes the character great.
The Surfer was an interesting character for me because anything was interesting to me at that point. I was just thrilled to be writing comics. It was, I was like I had been unleashed in the playground, and I could play with anything I wanted to. It was a huge amount of fun, and I guess looking back, I realized all the stuff I didn't know at that point, all the storytelling, all the techniques that I've since, glommed onto, and the light has gone on. But initially it was just that burst of enthusiasm and creativity. I had a ball doing it.
I love comics as a medium because it allows you to do anything. We have access to things that the movies don't have, such as what's going on in the heads of the characters. We can stop and play with time much more easily than a movie editor can. We have the advantages of print with also the advantages of a visual media. We were like the first step before you go to a movie. We're in effect a storyboard, but a storyboard that has a lot more avenues of experimentation than any other media has.
Well, my initial reaction to The Surfer was extremely positive. That was the first comic book that I ever bought, Fantastic Four 49, which was right in the middle of the initial Surfer story. And I was so taken by this thing that I'm sure it has a lot to do with the fact that I'm doing comics today.
I guess to me, the Surfer really represents the beginning of my career. To be able to play with one of the classic characters, really in all of comics, not just Marvel. Right out of the gate, I consider myself extremely blessed.
I hate to say it, but you might as well be prepared. I happen to be my biggest fan. When people walk over to me sometime and say, "I'm your biggest fan," I say, "No, you're not."